welcome. Welcome to this panel, which is to talk about coexisting with ocean users. We've heard a lot of exciting things this morning about all the momentum behind the offshore wind industry in the West and the great potential that the industry has to meet ambitious federal and state climate targets, provide clean energies to homes around the state, and create a number of green jobs. At the same time, as the industry scales up, another key part of the puzzle is making sure that it coexists with natural resources, like unique ocean habitats, like marine protected areas and marine sanctuaries, protected creatures that are really iconic to the West Coast, like seafaring birds, humpback whales, sea otters, and important commercial fisheries. I don't know if there's any Dungeness crab fans in the audience, but things like that depend on a thriving marine ecosystem. So it's really essential that as the offshore wind industry goes forward, it coexists with all of these important resources that make this place home and drive the blue economy. So I have here today a really expert panel to share their insights. To my left is Mike Conroy, who is a principal with the West Coast Fisheries Consultants, and then Gary George, a senior director with the National Audubon Society, Ben Ruttenberg, a director for coastal and marine sciences at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, and finally, last but not least, Holly Wire, a senior environmental scientist with the California Coastal Commission. So to start, I'd like to do some visioning from the future and hear from everybody here about there's a lot of forces at play. Offshore wind is really essential to fighting the climate crisis, and at the same time, the West Coast ecosystem is facing a lot of crises. You have rising ocean temperatures, a biodiversity crisis, challenges in various fisheries. So, I'd like to hear from the panelists here about, how they think about coexistence and how they think about balancing these various forces that are at play. And I will start with Holly.
Well, I think about, in my role at the Coastal Commission, I think about coexistence as consistency with our Coastal Act resource protection policies. And I think it's really important as part of that to have adaptive management integrated throughout the process.
Great. Ben?
I guess when I think of coexistence, I think of this trying to balance our need for carbon-free power, which is really why we're all here, with the needs of these other users of ocean space, things you talked about. There's lots of other stuff happening out there. And so is there a way for us to understand where we might be able to generate the most carbon-free power with the least effects on the rest of that system? Right, so thinking about what kinds of information we need to be able to put these things in the right place and be able to understand if there's an impact happening, how do we try to minimize those impacts or mitigate those impacts?
Great. Gary?
And I agree, and I think that the most important part is for coexistence is that that we learn how to avoid, minimize, and mitigate effectively for the impacts of this desperately needed clean energy in gigawatts on our ocean resources and our ocean users. And I represent what I think are some of the most abundant users, maybe except for fish. The birds are everywhere in the Pacific Ocean and all through the California current system. So, coexistence means really looking at ways to avoid, minimize, and mitigate effectively.
Thanks. Finally, Mike.
Yeah, coexistence, I think, to me, means thriving fisheries, recreational, commercial, and tribal fisheries alongside a developing and growing offshore wind industry to fit that need. In terms of how do we get there, and this is no surprise, the fishing industry has said this for a while now, do this with us rather as opposed to us. Having conversations early on in the process, especially at the siting decision-making stage, is most important. I am encouraged by work we've seen come through the National Marine Fisheries Service in terms of the fisheries data sets that they provided for Oregon in developing the draft wind energy areas off Oregon, and they have a couple other products that they're working on now that I think will be very informative as we move forward to what we called earlier today, California Round 2.
Great. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. We'll have more time to get into the details as this panel goes on, but I sort of like knowing what big visions you all have in mind as we look towards the future. One of the, to me it seems like the very, very starting point for all of this is making sure that the right voices are at the table and bringing all the stakeholders to talk to regulators, to talk to developers. So I'm curious to hear more about how that's happening in California and what examples we can look to make sure that the right voices are being heard as part of the management process. So I'd like to start with Holly to just hear what the state is doing around engaging different stakeholders, and then also to hear if there's any examples from other regulatory environments that you think are useful in the offshore wind context.
Sure. I think we've heard a bit about this from other panels today as well. I know Elizabeth Heber earlier talked about all the stakeholder engagement the state has done as part of the AB 525 strategic planning process, and that was really extensive, including a tribal working group, numerous stakeholder meetings and workshops, specific workshops tailored to the fishing industry, and that really was to bring all the voices into the state's strategic plan for offshore wind moving forward. From the Coastal Commission's perspective, we're really looking at coexistence and bringing in stakeholders as it relates to the resource protection areas of the Coastal Act, and that includes things like tribal cultural resources, environmental justice communities, fishing communities, biologists, and folks that we need to help protect our biological resources as we move forward. And I think you also asked me about other offshore projects.
Yeah, if there's other examples for how to bring stakeholders to the table from other regulatory environments, maybe other offshore projects or other contexts.
Yeah, so we, in the past, specifically with the fishing industry, we can look to other offshore projects for how we've done mitigation for those kinds of impacts. One thing I will say is offshore wind is just much bigger than those projects in terms of scale and how much space is taking up. So those projects are really a starting point, but they're not the end all of what coexistence looks like for fishing and offshore wind. Some of those other projects include things like fiber optics cables, oil and gas, aquaculture, and they've done things like establish transit corridors or have really good communication, like providing as-built designs for infrastructure offshore. And they also have done things like set up resiliency funds for the fishing community so they can have access to things like better navigation equipment on their boats and other things that make fishing more achievable in a more crowded marine environment.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great next segue to the next question that I wanted to ask, which is for Mike. So one vehicle to bring the fishing community to the table is SB 286, which created a fisheries working group. And so I'm curious if you could share your perspective on how that's going and how that's been successful to date at incorporating the interests of the fishing community.
Yeah, so SB 286 kind of codified what the Coastal Commission included in its conditional concurrence on the consistency determination for the BOEM leases. We started meeting, I believe it was at the beginning of this year, or maybe it was the end of last year. I think what we've learned to date is the complexity of the tasks that we're being asked to do. We're making headway. I think it's complex, and I think that we're making as much headway as we could have through now, and I look forward to doing more work with it. But the one thing that I'm taking away from it up to this date is, fishermen, offshore wind developers, state agencies, federal agencies, we're all sitting together and we're kind of working through some really difficult issues with an eye toward coexistence.
Yeah. Appreciate you sharing that. And other stakeholders that are in the mix include the environmental community. So I'd like to hear from Ben and Gary about what your thoughts are about how to bring those interest groups to the table.
So it hasn't been that difficult, really, because we all formed coalitions right away on offshore wind, not only to solve the climate crisis, but also the biodiversity crisis. So there's a really good national coalition that's formed, led by National Wildlife Federation with the NRDC and Ocean Conservancy and Audubon and Conservation Law Foundation and others that have been engaged in the stakeholder process for every part of the BOEM process in the Atlantic and in the Gulf and here. And I just want to call out the BOEM process for us, for the environmental groups, especially for birds, that the avoidance, the way that BOEM did a stakeholder process and considered all the comments from different people, they really avoided large congregations of birds, and they really listened to us. I don't know if it's true for everybody in that process, but they certainly listened to a lot of the environmental groups, and they did make adjustments. So there was a process, a stepwise process, to get to the wind energy areas that did a lot of avoidance, which is the first part of the mitigation hierarchy. So I want to call out BOEM for doing that good work. And here in California, Doug Boren led that work, and I think they did a really good job identifying the wind energy areas.
Great. And Ben, anything else to add about how the academic community has been brought into this process and how the great research you're doing has become part of regulation?
Thanks. It's interesting to try to represent the entire academic community here as the lone academic scientist around today. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of the agencies have supported a lot of research that the academic community has done, kind of moving towards this, and it's been really encouraging to see the RFPs and the calls come out to address very specific questions. Obviously, as an academic scientist, I think what do we need? We need more data. So we need more money. We need more data. We need more money, right? And there's never going to be enough of either of those things to answer the questions that we really want to answer. And so I guess that the challenge really is thinking about how do we go about trying to understand what we actually need to know to do this in a way that, like I said, maximizes the benefit of generating power with low carbon emissions and minimizes the impact to all these other users of ocean space.
Yeah.
So as an example, the OPC has funded the monitoring guidance process. That work is ongoing. We're realizing as we step into this just how big of a task that is, even to try to understand what it is that we need to know with every one of these different aspects of the system.
Yeah, and that's a great segue to the next set of things that I wanted to talk about, which is managing the impacts from the offshore wind process. We know from the research that's been done to date by state agencies like the CEC, as well as BOEM, that there are various impacts expected from the California development. Impacts to birds, impacts to marine mammals, impacts to sea life, potentially ocean processes like upwelling and nutrient cycling. So I'd like to do a little deeper of a dive into all of that and hear your views. And maybe I'll start with Gary to hear more about management of impacts to avian species.
Sure. So the impacts, offshore wind impacts and onshore wind in many ways impacts birds in three ways. One is collision with the turbines. One is displacement from foraging or feeding grounds or migratory pathways where they go through the ocean. And the other is if a few individuals are removed from a very small population, that can have a population level effect that can really affect the survival of that population of birds. So those are the three big impacts. So managing them really, one of the exciting things about offshore wind now is that we are doing a lot of research. We are finding out more and more about how the birds are behaving out there and how the birds are moving out there. We're compiling a lot of research, so that part is very exciting. But we're going to manage those impacts, we're going to have to avoid, minimize, monitor, and we can have that conversation of monitoring now, or we can have it later. But monitoring is going to be a key part of understanding the impacts of offshore wind.
Yeah, Mike, what are your thoughts about managing impacts to fisheries?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and I could take the rest of the time just talking about that, but I won't. We break it down into known versus the unknown, right? And based upon what we understand, what the typical floating offshore wind farm will look like, it's pretty much going to be displacing bottom contact gear, other types of fixed gear. There will be some fisheries that we believe will be able to operate within the footprint of a wind farm, but there will be impacts to fisheries who are displaced. Those fishermen will have to move to a different place, so there will be impacts on harvesters that are located in those areas. So the displacement effect is one thing. Potential impacts in ports and harbors is another thing that we're looking at. To the degree that effort is displaced, will that keep the product from coming across the dock? If the product doesn't come across the dock, is the processor located within that port and harbor going to be able to keep their doors open? So is there sort of that cascading effect too? Because then that has a circular effect, because that'll impact the amount that can be harvested in that area, because they'll have to go take it somewhere else. So those are two of the impacts that we're looking at from that standpoint. There's a number of other. One of the ones that we're extremely concerned about is the ability of National Marine Fisheries Service to run their scientific surveys through these areas. The data that's been collected informs stock assessments and sets harvest levels, harvest guidelines. So if we remove transects from those lines, it increases the amount of uncertainty in the science, and therefore, under the precautionary principle of fisheries management, we're able to take less. So that's another concern that we have. And then, going into the unknowns, I think, Gary, you mentioned it, upwelling, or Holly, somebody mentioned upwelling larval, it was you, sorry. Upwelling, larval transport, and all those things, migratory patterns of whales, are they going to change? Are they going to be altered? Are they going to go closer to shore, which is going to increase the risk of entanglement with their crab fisheries? Based on the way crab fisheries are managed, that's going to result in either the delay opening of the fishery even more or closing it earlier. So there's a lot of impacts that remain to be unknown, which is why whatever approach we take on this, it has to be adaptive, and we got to get the data that we need so that we have as is, so that we can know once we start deploying the infrastructure to support offshore wind, what are the impacts. We're not left basing our decisions on modeled information, but rather on observational information.
Yeah. Well, before I transition fully into the unknown unknowns, I did want to check in with Ben and see if he has other recommendations for how to manage certain of the impacts that we know about.
Yeah, I mean, so again, I think both of you hit on this main topic, is that what we really need is more data, right? We need more information about what's happening out there. So what I'd suggest is that we start doing some of this monitoring about 10 or 15 years ago. I think that would help tremendously in this space. But I mean, in all seriousness, I think we do need to start very soon. And so I think trying to identify, to the extent, to the detail level as possible, as concretely as possible, what do we actually need to know, and what can we start collecting quickly? Along the same lines, some data exist in these spaces. I think the big challenge with wind, as opposed to a lot of the other things that Holly talked about, is that it's in spaces that there hasn't been a ton of activity. And so there isn't a ton of information known about these places. And and what California is trying to do is literally unprecedented in the world. Like there are going to be no wind farms of this size, of this scale, in waters that are this deep anywhere else in the world. And so we're going to have to figure out how to do a lot of this kind of on the fly. Gary's talked some about technologies and developing new technologies to do some of that monitoring, so that will reduce the cost. And also thinking about, trying to understand how much of this information do we actually need, because we know that to collect all the information that at least the scientists want will be absolutely cost prohibitive. And so how do we balance that, trying to reduce the uncertainty that Mike talked about, make sure that we have enough information to get that uncertainty down to a level that makes sense without having it, essentially cost so much that this whole thing becomes unworkable.
Yeah, for sure. We've been seeing pieces of this monitoring framework and monitoring recommendations moving forward in different ways. For example, conditions in the leases, things that have come out of the Coastal Commission and concurring with the BOEM leases, the process that's going forward at the Ocean Protection Council and developing monitoring guidelines. I'd like to turn it over to Holly and just sort of hear how you're thinking about these different state efforts to collect data, to put monitoring guidelines in place, and sort of see what building blocks you're seeing fall into place and what you're looking forward to seeing going forward.
Yeah, I'm really excited for the Ocean Protection Council's monitoring guidance project, which is being headlined by the California Marine Sanctuary Foundation. I think that's just an incredibly important next step for us. I feel like folks have said, we've been asking for monitoring for the past several years, and I'm really excited for us to get past a place of saying we need monitoring and here is exactly what we need to go do. And that's going to be so important for us moving forward. When we're looking at permits down the road, we make decisions on those permits based on the data that we have and worst case scenario assumptions if we don't have data. And then we monitor to confirm our assumptions. But we require mitigation based on the data that we had at the time. So I think the more informed we are going into this, the better job we're going to do as those permits come up.
Can I add to that a little bit? And that is that, when we think of monitoring, we think of above the water and on the water for birds, which is a little different from other kinds of data collection. But that monitoring for collision is a very important part of the monitoring, as well as displacement of birds. But this is a very, very exciting time for the development of these technologies, and there's a lot of money being put into the development of monitoring technologies with imaging, radar, acoustics, using all of that, tagging birds to understand how they're interacting with the turbines. And it's actually a very, very exciting time for these new kinds of research. So I would think scientific researchers, I'm on 3 or 4 technical advisory committees, I would think researchers would be very excited about this explosion of new ways to collect data. It's been an opportunity, thanks in part to the offshore wind development, that these things are happening. So
Yeah,
it's
just to follow up on that, Gary, are there things that developers, looking towards their construction and operations phases could do today to start building those solutions into what they're designing?
Yeah, I think one thing is, I know in the Atlantic, we collaborate in the Regional Wildlife Scientific Collaboration, so the developers, the NGOs, and the federal and state agencies get a chance to talk about these things. So I think there's probably a little more information on it, and I can't wait for that to happen here in California. And if you heard it all day long, I know. So with AB 80 and the development of that, so that developers can talk and hear about it. And I would love if the developers got even more excited. I know there's a lot it takes to get a wind project up and running, but this is going to be a really important part. It's not if, it's like when. And I'd love it if developers got more interested in it, and their consultants in these fantastic monitoring technologies, some of which have already been used in the United States on offshore wind.
Yeah, Mike, you mentioned, different things that you're concerned about, changes in fishing patterns, changes to the benthic habitat, changes to ocean processes. I'm curious what you see as the data gathering needs, and whether, you have what are the data gathering needs that you see?
Yeah, boy, there's a lot. And this will be the 4th or 5th time that I've said this today. So for the 3 or 4 of you that have heard this already, you can tune out. But we've been hearing a lot lately about data gaps, research needs, and conversations about, okay, what do we do to collect those? And we need to go from talking about the need to do this stuff to actually doing it. With construction happening within likely the next 4 or 5 years off California, we need to start getting that as is data. We need to have the baseline so that we can take and from the observations from once the construction begins and energy is starting to be generated. We need that information today so that we can make informed decisions later. The one thing, and it struck me, there was a panel, I believe it was the one before us, where the individual was talking about they were surprised with how much insects that there are out off the coast. Ask a fisherman. I could have told you that there are boatloads of insects 40, 50 miles off the coast. We see it all the time, especially in the summer. The amount of dragonflies when you wake up on a boat, don't even get me started. But be that as it may, the important thing here is you have to take advantage of the knowledge that's housed within the fishermen's heads. It's, a lot of it's useless. I'm not going to sit here and say that it's all helpful. A lot of it will drive you crazy, but there's always going to be a kernel of something there that it's going to be an oh crap moment. So I would strongly encourage, the developers, the agencies, be it state or federal, incorporate and bring in that fisherman's ecological knowledge into these decision-making processes. It may save you some time, and it may open up some more ideas that you have on things that could be researched.
Yeah. And I imagine the same could be said, too, for traditional ecological knowledge from indigenous folks. We don't have anybody from tribal nations on this panel today, but that's another important source of information about the coastal and marine environments.
And if I can follow up on that, it's not just fishermen's knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge. There are tons of data sets shouldn't say tons. There are data sets that exist out in some of these spaces. Some of them are proprietary. Some of them are housed in agency data, databases. They don't talk well to each other. And so I think there's a part of a data discovery process that there's stuff out there that exists that we can use. And maybe it's not, if we were going to design it from scratch, it's not what we would go do, but it's going to tell us something. And especially as we know, the oceans are changing, right? And so what is happening today is probably not what was going on 20 years ago, and it's probably not what's going to be going on 20 years from now. And so, starting as soon as possible and trying to timecast as much as we can, using as much information as we can find, wherever we can find it, is going to be useful. The other huge challenge is that a lot of the critters, organisms, really important species that we're talking about out here are not, tied to a specific habitat place, right? Like on land. They're following oceanographic features which are highly variable in space and time. And so, you've got processes happening offshore. The primary productivity is following that. The bait fish are following those. The larger fish are following those. The birds and the marine mammals are following that stuff. And so, how are those things moving around? How are the species we're talking about that are using this California current ecosystem? How are they going to be responding to those? To that movement, and how is that going to change as the climate changes?
Yeah. Well, getting to one of the audience questions, follow-up question for you, Ben, is do you have a framework in mind that can help stitch all that information together?
Yeah. I mean, so the monitoring guidance program that CMSF is running, that California Marine Sanctuary Foundation is running from OPC, is a great start. The RWSC on the East Coast is another model, and again, I'm not going to say that this is the best way or that's the best way, but there are models out there that are doing things like this, and so let's figure out. Again, it's like let's figure out what's working here and there, and apply that to this place, and set up that framework where you have the experts on who really understand the details of individual processes, telling us, the rest of us, what it is that specifically we need to be collecting information on, and we can do that for every one of the features of these systems that we need to understand, using as many different data sources as possible. Obviously, that's going to take resources, and so just encourage the agency folks to think about funding that in a robust way so that we can do this work really effectively.
Yeah, for sure. I'm going to pick on Gary here, since he was one of the ENGO members that sat on the RWSC on the East Coast. And I am curious, what you have seen come out of that process, and what the benefits of having an RWSC out here would be.
I'm still sitting on the steering committee, so along with National Wildlife Federation and TNC. So what's come out of it, besides the relationship building and the 11 states that are involved in it, the state agencies and all the data collections, is we developed a science plan which came out in January. This took through several different subcommittees, and that science plan really lays out how to close a lot of the data gaps that the scientists are really worried about. So it's a very clear science plan by species, benthic species, birds and bats, marine mammals, et cetera, essential fish. So that's the science plan. That's the first part. And now we're in a place, because New York and Massachusetts and New Jersey have a different kind of procurement standard, where developers who bid into selling their energy to the procurement agency, they have to dedicate a certain amount of money. In New York, it's $10,000 a megawatt toward understanding, mitigating and monitoring for fisheries and wildlife. And so the RWSC now has an opportunity to play a big role in how to do that in terms of issuing grants and also taking in the data and making the data totally publicly available, which are two things that we think are priorities. So that's some of what we've done. We're just getting started. So
Yeah, exciting times. Turning to another audience question. One of the questions here is about staffing at agencies and how that would help with things like the permitting process, things like, and other parts that go into that, collecting the data, analyzing the data. So I'm curious to turn this one to Holly and to see, what are the needs that you see at the various agencies, and what would be helpful to have as we look towards new wind projects and new data that needs to be collected?
I think earlier today we heard from the manager of my section, Joe, that we have like 3 people that work on offshore wind. So I think more resources for staff would be helpful, but I don't work in a role where I do that sort of thing, so I can't speak to that.
Yeah, exciting times. I'm curious, Gary, you mentioned some technologies earlier that could be part of offshore wind arrays and help detect birds and bats.
Yeah, okay. So
Can
let
you
me
share more?
I'll tell you one that in Virginia, Dominion allowed a company called Normando to put a technology called Atom on one of their turbines for a year. And the technology actually has images as well as other detection devices, and it can run night and day. And in that year, they found no collisions at all. They found that they could identify some species of birds down to the warbler. They identified a Kirtland's warbler from an image. They watched the birds and bats as they interacted with the turbine, and they actually, what you could find that we don't find, here on land, the biologists walk around under the turbines to pick up dead birds, right? Or use dogs, which is even better than biologists, to pick up dead birds. And then you count the dead ones, right? Well, here, with these kinds of technologies, with imaging and other detection devices running for that period of time, you can begin to see the kind of avoidance rates that different species have. So it's actually, you begin to tell a story not of what's dying, but what's avoiding and how they're avoiding, that might actually inform better management practices of the turbines. So that's one. There's a new, Woods Hole in Massachusetts has a new kind of submarine detector that they're doing. There's a CEC grant, and thank you for the California Energy Commission EPIC program for funding research on offshore wind. That Integral is here, I think, and they're using. That's going to be a big process for understanding and monitoring offshore wind. There's WT Bird. There's lots and lots of new technologies that actually can work and that have been verified. What we don't have is a market for them yet, and the market will come. Either the market can come from the industry saying, oh, we want to get involved in those, and maybe we'll economically buy them at scale or try them at scale, or get credits from the service maybe for using them on their projects, or a sample of their turbines, not all the turbines, and or the regulators are going to require it at some point, because it's all about public trust, and I don't think the public's going to say, you put offshore wind out there and we don't know what's happening. I just don't think that's going to wash with the public. I don't think it's going to wash. I think it's going to hurt offshore wind. So we're gung-ho in investing a lot of energy into being part of that development of those technologies. And I think you'll hear more from the Department of Energy's Wind Energy Technology Office on Thursday, because they've also been developing a lot of those technologies. They see it as an important part of wind development, is the ability to monitor those impacts.
Yep. Yeah, I'm curious to hear more about potential management measures. So say you get all this great monitoring in place and the data comes back and then it turns out that some things should be adjusted. Maybe I'll turn it to Mike, because you also attend a lot of Fishery Council meetings, and I think that there is a lot of actually very active management that happens in these other regulatory contexts. So I'm curious, if you could share your experiences there, and talk about how adaptive management or management could be done in the offshore wind environment.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. And yes, I spend far too much time at Pacific Fishery Management Council and other fun fishery management related meetings. And those are nimble. They are based on a timeline. And you look at the salmon season, for example. We don't have one in California this year. I'm not going to go down that road. But every year we go through the management process on that, and we set harvest levels that are based on the escapement from the prior year. So, fisheries are managed in a very proactive yet reactionary way based upon data that comes in. How that would play in this offshore wind space, I think that remains to be seen. But one of the things that it's going to be one thing on the East Coast if you site your turbines too close together, so you can pull the piles out, move it half a mile, and drive it in, send it back up. I think with floating offshore wind, if we find that there is an environmental or an ecological problem being caused by something, whatever that something is, it would seem that with floating, we have some flexibility so that if 1 mile apart between turbines is causing a problem, but maybe 1.5 won't, then maybe we can be adaptive in that way. But it's going to require some thought. It's going to require some detailed conversations, but it remained to be seen how adaptive we really can be in terms of responding to things that we see on the water.
Yeah. Ben, do you have thoughts about adaptive management?
I mean, I agree. I think it's really going to be very much context dependent. Sort of depending on what the thing is that we're talking about, what the impact is. How severe it is. Is there something that we could do? Thinking about birds as an example. Let's say that we realize that there's some oceanographic feature and a bunch of birds are now following that feature that happens to be sitting right underneath the turbines. Well, and maybe they're interacting in a way that could lead to mortality. Maybe you shut the turbines down. That is at least a relatively simple mitigation measure. There's some new technologies that people are thinking about to try to reduce entanglement of marine mammals, right? We think that, primary entanglement, right, marine mammals getting hung up on the anchor cables themselves is probably really unlikely, but secondary and tertiary where you have fishing gear that's hung up on the lines that then a marine mammal swims through, that could be an issue. And so, maybe there's some way that, and I know some folks at Humboldt are working on a project to develop technology to try to detect changes in the vibrations on the cables, that when fishing gear hits that cable, it may change the vibrations of that cable to indicate that there's something there. So maybe you have a crawler or an ROV or send a person out, a boat, to go pull that gear off of that line before something can happen again. And those are just a couple of very small examples. And I think that depending on what it is, which aspect of the system we're talking about is going to determine whether and what it is that we need to do.
Yeah. Mike.
Yeah, no, and you just bring up a great point that reminded me. One of the things I mentioned earlier was changing migratory patterns of whales, right? But if we know that there are humpback whales or blue whales in the area, we should know by the time these things are up and going what type of sound is going to be generated by them. Yeah. And if we know that this certain type of frequency of sound or this certain level of sound is going to be one that's going to change those migratory patterns, then maybe an adaptive management tool would be to develop a muffler or something else that's going to make it less noisy so that we're not going to have the unintended consequence of shutting down the crab fishery because whales are avoiding the sound and swimming closer to shore.
Yeah. Gary, anything else to add? There's a lot on onshore wind that's being done for adaptive management.
There is a lot. There's again, it's new technologies, which are very exciting. There's a new technology called Identiflight that actually can detect eagles coming toward a site, and they can actually turn the turbines off smartly, so it's only seconds. You only lose a little bit of the energy, and then when the eagles pass through, the turbines can start up again. It's not hard on the turbines. It's like feathering a sail. So there's all kinds of new kinds of technologies that are actually developing now, new ways to avoid and minimize. So I personally think it's a very exciting time now that we've got a lot of structure up to actually begin to developing those kinds of technologies. I think it's a great way to go.
Yeah.
Other than sighting, of course, being the most important.
Yeah. Ooh, there's some exciting new questions that have come in. One of the questions is maybe a continuation of this conversation that we're having, is looking to other environments like the European Union or Asia. Are there any things we can learn from those environments?
Probably.
Or
somebody out there may know more.
Yeah, maybe talk to other conference panelists and find out.
Well, we can learn generalities, right? But to the extent those are all fixed turbines, fixed infrastructure, there will be differences because of the floating.
There's a great thing that New York CERTA does every year called the State of the Science, and we have seen really good presentations from other countries that come there, Denmark especially, on how they manage turbines in wetlands, with migratory bird periods and stuff, and how they have gotten it down to a science of when to turn the turbines off a certain period, and et cetera. So there are different countries that are managing it a different way. I don't know how Asia is managing it, but I know that Europe is looking at managing their wildlife.
Yeah, I've heard some interesting compensatory mitigation projects from Europe as well. So if certain bird species have been displaced in certain places, they set up bird habitat
They did
for that.
I think it was black-legged kittiwake.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, how are those projects working out?
I think the data's not all there yet because it's pretty new, but I think that was actually done by a company, and it was their idea. And that is another thing, is there is a creative period now, I think, even with the service. You can talk to the service about it, but there are creative ways now to do compensatory mitigation. You could maybe do it in advance. Maybe you could add research to your project on something that's like that and get some sort of credit for it, or offset some potential take in the future or something. So I think there's lots of creative new ways to look at that. And that's, I don't know for whales, but that's for birds. That is, there are some companies that are doing that in the UK and the EU.
Yeah. Yeah, Ben and Holly, are you aware of compensatory mitigation projects in your research and investigations that would be of interest here?
Sorry, did you mean compensatory mitigation for marine wildlife or for fisheries or anything? Anything. I don't know specifically to like the EU and Asia context, but I think we have been looking at what's happened on the East Coast for compensatory mitigation, how that's played out, and are aiming to avoid pitfalls here. And just trying to take the lessons learned from our colleagues on the East Coast as we start thinking about compensatory mitigation and what that looks like in California.
Yeah, compensatory mitigation. I plead ignorance on that and what's happening in Europe. But thinking about the monitoring approaches, there are a lot of things that that the Europeans have learned. The challenge, of course, is that how many of them are actually applicable here, right? The environments are totally different. We're talking about floating, not fixed, much further offshore, and obviously the species and the ecosystem is completely different. And so, how many of those lessons are going to be useful? I don't really know. Things like the impacts of EMF on marine species. From what I've seen, the research out of Europe seems to suggest that those impacts are pretty minor. And so, that's something that's likely to be reasonably translatable here. But again, the species on this coast might interact with these things really differently. So.
Yeah, it's a lot. Mike, any closing thoughts about compensatory mitigation? I think we're nearing the end of our panel.
See Holly over there? One of the deliverables for the statewide strategy under SB 286 is a framework to develop, describe, define compensatory mitigation. And that's going to be the fun one.
Yeah.
I have lots of thoughts on it, just I don't want to really say something that can be used against me.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can actually move towards wrapping up, because we've heard a lot today about the different impacts in the ocean environment to be concerned about. There's a lot of technological promise to understand what's happening in the water. There's a lot of baseline information that needs to be gathered still, and there are helpful examples from other regulatory environments like fisheries or other jurisdictions that could be helpful. So I think I'd just like to go down the line and hear from folks about, as you look at all these moving factors in the California ocean environment, and then as you look towards the future, what are you excited about? What do you want to see in the next couple of years? Holly.
I'm really excited to see the relationships and the develop and the progress being made in the fishing working group. Like Mike said, progress can be slow and a little tedious, but seeing the breakthroughs has been really rewarding. I'm also looking forward to continuing to build our relationship with our East Coast colleagues and learning from their experience as we start to develop similar programs for monitoring over here.
Great. Ben?
I guess thinking about what the last panel was talking about, some of the speed or lack thereof at which a lot of these processes move, and wanted to avoid sort of doing things sequentially, that we really kind of need to be thinking about a lot of this stuff in parallel. And I think we need to take that approach here as well, that there are a lot of things we need to do, right? We need to develop guidance. We need to understand what data sets exist. We need to understand what people have done in other places that have been successful. And if I was an academic, I would do that in a linear fashion. But I think we just don't have time to do that. And so we're going to need to really start moving kind of full steam ahead on a whole bunch of different fronts, which comes back again. I feel like a broken record as an academic, saying, well, we're going to need some more resources for that. So and it is, and it's gonna cost some money. But I think that the cost of setting up the monitoring structures, understanding what it is that we need to know, finding out what data sets exist so we can try to understand at least how things have been in the past, that cost is going to be a drop in the bucket relative to the overall cost of this project. And I think it's going to make all of this so much more successful if we do this right up front. Not just from a, hey, this is the right thing to do with respect to the environment, but there's also a huge social relations component that people have been talking about, misinformation, disinformation, or just people uninformed in this space. And so I think setting these things up in a way that is going to generate this information in a way that everybody in this room feels on board with the science that's coming out, but also everybody who's not in this room also is going to see that okay, we have faith in this process, we have faith in the science that's being collected, and we have faith that this process is moving forward in a way that's not going to result in a whole bunch of really, really adverse impacts.
Yeah.
So our scientists spent 5 years on a report called Survival by Degrees, and what they found was that we will probably lose 389 species of North American birds if warming climbs to 3 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And that was the shocker and the frame for all of our work. So I'm most excited about as many gigawatts as we can get to keep warming down to protect birds and get to 100% clean energy. So that's really the goal. It's exciting that a lot of other things are happening at the same time. I think we can walk and chew gum at the same time. So I can see these other more data collection, more technologies, better siting happening at the same time. But rapid deployment of well-sited and operated wind energy and offshore wind is critical to move as fast as we can.
Yeah. Mike, close us out.
Yeah, and I'm with Holly with regard to seeing the fisheries working group moving forward. We started off as infants. A few of us started to run. Now we're realizing that maybe we should have just crawled and walked and go about this more of a stepwise process. And I think I look forward to finishing that, to continue to develop relationships with the offshore wind industry folks that are a part of that working group. In terms of doing it responsibly, if we're going to go big on offshore wind, which the state of California has kind of expressed its intention to do, let's do it thoughtfully. Let's do it responsibly. The fishing industry in 2021, according to NOAA, and this is commercial, recreational, and the processing side, it supported 187,000 jobs in California and generated $31 billion in sales. So the fishing industry is one that's important to work with, ensure that it continues to operate side by side, and welcomes offshore wind in a way that doesn't inhibit our activities, doesn't inhibit your activities, and we can find common ground where we can work together to make improvements, maybe at the port side, at the science side, and wherever, in a way that we both benefit from it. So you got 30 seconds.
Great. Well, I'd just like to say, please give a big thank you to the panelists for sharing their insights. It's a lot of good information. Yeah. Onwards. Well, thanks.